Stevenson teachers could please go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Kelly Dean. I teach both biology and physics.
I'll go next. Hi, I'm Molly Sponseller. I teach earth science.
I'm Deanna Workins, and I teach chemistry and earth science.
Brett Erdman is the assistant director, and he teaches biology. And I'm Steve Wood, I'm director, and I don't teach anything. And Tommy Wolf might be jumping on. He teaches biology and has taught physics recently.
Please share with us why you moved away from traditional grading and how you're implementing standards-based grading, and what factors kind of led to that change.
I was actually on both of the teams that in science implemented evidence-based reporting early on. And I think we had recently gone through some curriculum changes to implement NGSS, and we recognized that we were hitting a lot of the right DCIs, but we weren't actually asking students to do the performance events as written with the skills. And so we thought that evidence-based grading really lent itself to having students do the science and engineering practices. And so we use those as our skills and just inserted whatever different topic for whatever different unit into that.
I also implemented physics with Kelly. We were on the first squad together to go through that. And I think the other thing that we had tried many times were like retakes, and we found what we focused on a lot was just vocabulary memorization, and there wasn't an understanding of some of the principles as well as an understanding of the DCIs as well as, using that skill. And so by switching to EBR, we were able to actually figure out more what the kids knew, and the type of questions that we were asking them made them actually prove to us what they learned from any of our lessons instead of just rote memorization. And that helped a lot of our students also that have IEPs or have, any sort of 504 or some of our multilingual learners as well, because we are now very specific about the skills, and they're learning to write with any DCIs if they're constructing an explanation. If they're doing data analysis and interpretation, they now know what we're looking for. They know how to take any image or any data table instead of us just every single time having to teach the data that we're doing right then. They now know how to manipulate those things more than I would have saw in my day-to-day class.
I'll jump to the next question here. What has motivated teachers to believe in evidence-based grading, and what benefits do they perceive, and what do you perceive?
A big one for us was being able to provide feedback to students in a more meaningful way. In the points-based system, we were developing lots of rubrics and things to show students like where points aligned. And I was also on the physics team, the college prep physics team, but we had a lot of learning targets, and we were giving students feedback like, you got 2 points off in this learning target. That's why you're not, we were using the words proficient, but it really felt like this like weird system where we were using points to give feedback to students on skills. And so something that motivated a lot of teachers was like, now we can just give students, rather than adding up how many points did they get off on this test? Like, was that enough? What was our cutoff for that learning target? Where are we at? We felt like, okay, we can look more holistically at the skill. Are they meeting the success criteria? Okay, cool. You're proficient on that skill, rather than feeling like, oh, they got points off for units on every single problem and every single answer, and now they're not meeting what we're calling proficient. But like, I would say that student is, whereas like this student who clearly has a big misconception about physics is. So we felt like the motivation of giving the students feedback on what skills they needed to improve, and even more like drilling down at another level, giving them feedback on the success criteria, that I think was a big motivator for a lot of teachers to see how this would be a powerful change.
The changes in the conversations with students and the language that they adopted. So these learning conversations go from, Mr. Erdman, what can I do to get 15 more points to get that A-, to how can I show proficiency on the skill of constructing explanations to your satisfaction to prove that I'm worthy of this grade. It's very, very different conversation, and worthy wasn't the right word, but
worthy.
it really is it really is shifting that conversation, and it's taking away the sticks and carrots approach to education. The points is the carrots, the sticks, I'll take away the points if you don't do this thing. It really is all about the feedback and the learning process.
Students also could see the skill moving forward from unit to unit. So if students had errors or issues in Unit 1, it wasn't like we're done with motion and now we're on to forces and you'll never see that motion stuff again. It's calculations or explanations or data interpretation throughout each unit. And so when students get feedback on their summatives, even if it's the end of the unit, they can still use that feedback to help them grow for the next unit. When we were points based, it was much more separated by, topic rather than asking students to do individual skills.
And you're also able to see like the progression of their skill. So like, for example, in earth science, we do modeling. And so like at the first time they're like, oh no, I don't even know what it means to have something in scale. And then by the end, they're like, okay, so what would the scale of this model be? And they're asking those questions, and just that shift to like focusing on the skill.
What drawbacks have you found with this approach versus traditional grading?
I would say the biggest drawback is that we're looking over time on increasing their development of their skill. And so, we're constantly giving feedback, and the conversation between the teacher and the student is live and active and daily. But communicating with a parent who wants to see a grade projected is very difficult for them, because we could talk to a student and say, no, they're really growing, they're doing a nice job, they didn't understand this, and we met and they're really doing so much better, and you can see the end of the semester, but that path isn't always so clear to all of the stakeholders. And I think that's the hardest, is because in the beginning of the semester it takes a little bit of time to get moving, and it's not that immediate gratification of that A on the test that they wanted. And so they may do well on a skill, and then there's only one thing in the grade book. There's not as many items in the grade book, and so that was probably the biggest hurdle. But
I think one of the hurdles getting started, and it might be like from where you are, is just developing the curriculum. Prior to this, we had lots of multiple choice tests that might have had a couple free response, but we certainly did not have a plethora of examples where students could practice the skill, could then have a formative with the skill, then have a summative with the skill. We struggled with creating our first assessments by, is just doing this one time enough? In physics, for every explanation that we give, students write 3 examples of an explanation so we can look for a pattern of success. Whereas in bio, we have students write 1 explanation. So there's just kind of that finding the sweet spot and creating the actual work that students do. Now, several years in, we've got all of those examples. We have easy ways to implement new things, but at the time, it took a lot of work. And I think that was a big deterrent for teams being excited to go EBR.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that also like that process of developing success criteria, like what does it mean to master this skill? That was a huge conversation on teams, and something that we really had to, like, it's still an ongoing process. But I don't know if I would call it a drawback. I think that like the conversations were really beneficial, and it gave us like greater ownership over those assessments that we were building. But that was definitely like time that we needed.
I think one little thing that's different is that this system doesn't have all those sort of daily dopamine hits for kids, just those little hits of, I got 5 out of 5, I got 10 points here, I got 12 points here. And so those are those little carrots that we were talking about before. We know they're not all that effective for really sort of complex work and developing skills over time, but it did, for some kids, keep them on track with keeping up with classwork. And for some kids, not all, but for some kids, we noticed that there's not equivalent valuing of in-class work or things that are considered homework.
You were advising like our PLCs, like to think through this work, and you could start all over again. What might you do differently?
I think Steve has probably shared with you, we have like a roadmap of getting to like where we are, and you would want to start with like your success criteria and develop some assessments. But one of the things that I found most valuable before we even went to evidence-based reporting is we implemented our SLO, our student learning objective, which now all of our SLOs relate to the SEPs. And we were able to try this in our courses with we gave kids points for it, but we graded them on a rubric. We had the same skill for several different assessments, and we collaboratively graded. And so by doing that, we were able to kind of practice what it would look like when we fully implemented. And I think that doing the collaborative grading, tracking a particular skill and assessing it based on how well students met the success criteria is something that's going to be really new to a lot of the teachers on your teams that are doing this if they're used to just points-based grading. And so having that practice, I think, before it actually like counted was really beneficial. That's advice. That's not something that we would do different.
Kind of going along with what Kelly said on like, you have like these multiple choice tests. It's kind of like reductionist, right? It's almost like it's tough because you don't know what you don't know, but you're still in that like mindset of like, this is how we assess. So kind of going back, I would think about kind of like the big picture. Like one of those reasons why I think we do this grading practice is because it allows students to do more authentic scientific skills versus kind of that rote memorization in the class. So kind of going back, I would think about like, what are the things we just want our students to like do, to produce, to generate in the classroom, like those tangible examples, and then kind of work back from there in terms of, okay, like what does that success criteria look like for that thing?
I've also found that in some of my classes when we're talking about success criteria is asking the students to predict what I would want on the assessment has really helped me write better success criteria, because they're much harder on themselves than you would ever be, and they think of things that you're like, oh yeah, I forgot that. So having the students come up with it too also puts it into perspective on like, because sometimes our leveling is too high for them and sometimes it's too low, and many times they'll offer both sides of that, and then you would pick the success criteria that works for them. And that's been super helpful for especially in chemistry when we were doing some of the stuff in modeling, like what should I look for in a model? And some of the stuff they came up with was things I would have never thought of.
I'm kind of curious, Tommy, for your opinion on this, but I think about like if we are currently standards-based grading, if we are going to competencies, which Tommy is our resident expert on competencies, I guess if I thought that was where we were going, I would maybe go there and not stop at standards-based. Like, Tommy, what do you think about that?
Yes and no, like, because yes, I would go there, but because part of competency-based education, like one of those pillars is proficiency-based assessment, right? Which is what we're doing. So if you were going competency-based where students do progress based on mastery, it's like you're doing the same work we did before, but you're really much more conscientious of like, what do we do when students don't learn? I mean, we already asked ourselves these questions, but if you're doing competency-based, you have to even be like more hyper aware. What do we do when students don't learn? And what do we do when students have mastered the material to go on? So you would just almost expand the context of like how we would have been thinking about it.
I think maybe sometimes I forget how much like paradigm shift we've gone through to get where we are at. And like that was one of the hardest parts, I think, was convinced, and still is. There are people that we work with who I don't think fully believe that this is a better model, or like think of it in terms of giving students feedback on skills rather than these like individual point-based moments. And so I think the paradigm shift maybe is part of the hardest part, but also then, Tommy, to your point, maybe you need to do the work to get here to be able to go ahead.
Yeah, I guess from what I found, like with others, I think it's definitely like the work we've done here has definitely helped with our paradigm shifts. When I've looked at like other examples from other schools, there's so many different ways at which schools have like kind of entered in like the competency-based realm, like starting with proficiency-based grading and like working in PLCs. The literature will consistently say that's a great stepping stone to like have that capacity.
The only thing I was going to add, I'm just not sure if all of our Maine friends know essentially, and you can nod your head if this is redundant, but we use single point rubrics. So on any given skill, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, developing, approaching, meeting, exceeding. So it's just one score. We don't scale out all the individual success criteria. And when we say success criteria for us in our model, it is either elements of that skill, what goes into constructing explanation, or and or it could be things like using scientific vocabulary or concepts appropriately. And that might lead me to be one thing that I would have done differently, or knowing how much can we handle, because the change has been enormous, and the things that our teachers have created are incredible. Honestly, we're not perfect, we're not there, but it's just amazing stuff. But one other piece that we have almost intentionally ignored are the cross-cutting concepts. So maybe I would have done it earlier, where I would put those in as success criteria that in some way the student either demonstrates or can explain a connection to how they use that lens of the cross-cutting concepts to whatever task they've been assigned.
So what's been the hardest part of the work?
I'd say the hardest part of the work, probably the work, like just like Kelly said, like having to make everything, right? But it was also it was a paradigm shift. And when I heard about this grading change, I was like, let's do this tomorrow. And I still there were so many times when I was doing it where even though I believed in it, it's so easy to go back and just what you know before. So it was still hard for me it was definitely a process for me to change my way about developing curriculum and teaching with it.
I think also now there are a lot more examples out there. Like even when I Google something, there's example CERs, claim evidence reasoning. There's examples even from NGSS, which when we started this work, none of that was there. Examples would probably be a place to start and look at some of those questions that other people in the country are asking, just to see is that something within. And then some of the other things that we just do is we look at the NGSS DCIs and how they put everything together. And some of those questions come out of there. You're like, ooh, that's a really good question. That's where I want to go with my unit. But I think one of the other things that was a cognitive shift for many of our teachers is we do not need as much content as we were stressed to hold on to. So a lot of teachers were very stressed that they wanted to teach certain concepts, and these are the golden, things of biology or chemistry or earth science. And we really needed to drop that idea of trying to do everything. And I think that was one of the biggest things that hurt teachers, and teachers were trying to do a better job of, because there's certain units that you've loved forever that might not make the cut, and just realizing that the skills and the things that are coming out of it is going to be so worthwhile. And it's really hard because you can't see the end product, but then when the students start turning it in, you're like, oh my gosh, they are doing so many more things than I ever would have expected.
I think related to what Deanna was just sharing, my teams have been doing this for 5 years, and we're continuing to hone in on the best way to do it. In our first year, we would give these monster 2-day tests. And then the next year we were we tried to fit this in as a model, and it's not a model at all. They're really just using this picture to explain. So let's make this a constructing explanations. And so we were trying to fit things in, and we've finally gotten to a point where I think we are much happier with what our assessments look like, the length of the assessments, the amount of practice that kids do. We feel much more comfortable recognizing what the students are doing and how they connect to a success criteria. We were expected to give something the next day, and we just had to put a product in front of a student, and it wasn't always the best thing. And so now that we've had several years to reflect and hone in on what's best, I think we'd all be much more proud of what we have now.
That we were in a kind of a sustained rollout of this. So there were some classes kind of in the old world and some classes in the new world of EBR. So then kids were navigating both of these worlds. Comparison, I guess, between the two classes. And now we live in a world where everything we do is EBR, that we don't even have to call it EBR. It's just the way that we do school. It's the way that we score and report. I think it's easier now because the mindsets are kind of all the same all the way around the school.
This is one of our skills scaled out. So SEP6, constructing explanations. This is for physics. Some of them are things you would have to do to construct an explanation, but you see CCC2 in there as cross-cutting concept. So we have one place where that has come in. And so when I talked earlier about giving students feedback, I would circle a student's at a 2 right now, and then I would give feedback down below, you are really good at doing a lot of things, but you're missing applying cause and effect. I'm missing that when I read through your explanations.
So Chrissy, if you can leave that up. One thing I'll just say, again, for our Maine friends, the scale, the 4-3-2-1 or exceeding down to developing, that's consistent across the division. And that was something that we did with the college prep physics team. We just said, let's come up with a scale. Let's just keep it the same consistently. So the verbiage across those boxes is the same for all courses, at least almost. It's almost identical. Because we knew that that wouldn't be where teachers and kids spend most of their time. Most of it's down below in the success criteria. So those are going to be slightly different from teams. Maybe they value something differently for one task or for that course. So the success criteria change somewhat across courses, but the scale stays the same.
How is your district school, like department, providing opportunities specifically for like subgroups of students, like ELLs, like more equity-based work, like IEPs, 504s, like getting all of those kinds of things in?
Every class that we teach, every science class that we teach is, every class in our school actually is graded on evidence-based reporting. So every subgroup of student experiences this. And so I think that any of the courses where students need like a support, like an English language class, they might have EL aides in the room, but they're still doing the same stuff as the rest of the students in their class, and they're held to the same expectations. We might modify to have like a vocab list in front of them, or we might modify to have them use a translator on their assessments or things like that. But I don't know that we're doing anything separate or different. I think it's just part of the instruction for meeting the needs of all of our diverse students.
Can somebody talk maybe just a little bit about leveled practice? Because I think Kelly answered yes, what Kelly said, yes to all that. But I think leveled practice might get into some of how that shakes out sometimes too.
Tommy, that's you. Talk about that.
Yeah, I can talk about it. Tommy, do you want to take it?
Sure. So and Christy, feel free to follow up. So I got leveled practice. I went to a competency-based conference at Westminster, and I just talked to some of the teachers that were presenting, and I really love the idea of level practice. And so we'll have a packet with the problems that it's very similar, like formative, summative. This is what a 3 looks like. And then you'll make problems that are 2 level, but they have supports, right? A lot of times they're just like, it's the exact same type of question, same format, but there's hints in there just to like get the students thinking, and like there's support, whether it's other frameworks. And then there's level 1, which is, hey, let's just like, it's kind of like your typical worksheets where it's like, oh, what are the reactants and products of photosynthesis? Like, how would we draw arrows going into a process or out? So it really breaks it down. And then there are some level 4 in those packets where you try to ask a challenge type of question. But that's really cool because students can enter. At first, you have students kind of start from level 1, so they get the idea of it. But as the year goes on, they're like, oh, I'm at a level 1. Like, I need to start on these questions. I'm going to try to go for the 3, and then maybe I'll go over to the 2 and get some hints now that I don't feel like I can do it completely. So it allows all students to work on the same thing, but at the level that they're at.
You can set up leveled problems where they're the exact same problem, but the 1s and 2s just have a lot of scaffolding, a little bit of scaffolding. The 3 is what it was like on an assessment, and the 4 might just be like that plus something. Or you can set up leveled practice where they're different problems, and so students can kind of traverse through them. It really just depends on what you want the students to get out of, but it gives them an entry point for practice.
One of the things that teachers have also worked on, if they don't give leveled practice, is on a summative. Like, people don't turn in blank summatives. As you would walk around on a summative, you could give a student some supports that you think they would need, whether it's a reminder or drawing something. And so then based upon that and how much support they need, their grade at the end would be altered, but they wouldn't just sit there and it wouldn't be a learning experience for all. So like in the past, you hand out the multiple choice assessment and the kids randomly guess or whatever if they're not doing so hot. But the same thing would apply on the summative. If a student is kind of blanked out, like as a teacher, I feel more empowered to walk around, give students support as they take it, and I make note of that. And then in the end, they know how much support they've received, but I don't any longer accept blank assessments.
Another thing outside of, it's not our division, but our school has a pretty robust MTSS system. And so we have interventions we run for students through, it's called mandatory targeted tutoring. And basically weekly, we put in student grades for eligibility, for athletic eligibility. And through that system, some students get like tagged or scooped for intervention. So if a student, and we've got different ways that gets identified, but if a student in my class, if I put in their weekly grade, I'll get a little pop-up that says like, do you want to enter this student into mandatory targeted tutoring? And this year, what's new is that the parents, the counselors, the student, and the teacher and tutors in our building all have access to that note. And so like I entered a student into their intervention system last week. I get to tag what skill they're working on. So those are integrated with our grade book to say like they are working on graphing. They need some support in graphing. And then I can put a note saying like they should specifically look at their review packet for extra graphing practice, or I will give them some extra problems to work on with the tutor or myself. And then when the students come in, so I had a student come in during lunch today, she sat with me, we worked through some problems, and I can put in notes into the system saying like, we worked on math problems. I think you're doing a really good job here. Let's work on some more derivations. Please come see me on Thursday. And then everyone sees that. So parents see it, students see it, counselors, tutors. And so it's a nice system to use. And I don't know that had to be from standards-based grading, but it was something that kind of we built in kind of robustly and have built alongside that. And so that's been really helpful to provide all of our students that support.
I'll just say one quick thing, and it might be in anticipation of the question that's coming, but I just want to say this like a global, because I see a question coming up about feedback from parents. So I'll just say one thing that I get, because you can imagine that parents not always calling me to thank me for the wonderful science experience their kids are getting. It's when maybe things go sideways. And the one thing that comes up around standards-based grading is often this word subjective. And I push back really hard because we say that our scores and grades are determined by the calibrated professional judgment of teachers supported by evidence. That's the mantra, and I'll repeat that to a parent because they'll say, well, it's just so subjective. You know, the teacher doesn't like my kid. It's so subjective. No. It's a professional judgment that the teacher makes. Just like when your doctor renders an opinion and you go to a second opinion, or a legal team renders an opinion, or a judge gives an opinion. The teacher is giving an opinion, but it's a professional judgment. It's not subjective, which is a very pejorative way that parents will come at it. So I'll just say from my phone, that's one conversation that has come up, and I'm pretty clear and ready for that because that drives me crazy because it to me, it diminishes the professionalism of our teachers.
Thank you, Steve. That's exactly where I was going to head. Was we just had some questions about feedback that you might have gotten from students who have gone off to college, who have kind of gone through this system. If they've noted that they feel well prepared, and then any other feedback you might have gotten from parents. I know you mentioned a little bit the parents sometimes maybe aren't always in the loop with communication as much. So anything you could add to that would be great.
Go ahead,
I feel like some of the things we get feedback from students doesn't have anything to do with the grading. It's like, oh my gosh, I remember doing this lab and it was so helpful in college. Like, I think after they leave, it's not about the grade that they got any longer, which while they're here, of course, it's about the grade that they got in order to prepare for college and get there. But I don't ever get any negative feedback while they're at school.
Yeah, I was going to say, I hear about like the experiences that they had and like those are what they value. I also would think like, because this is just the world that like Stevenson, that's what we do, right? Every experience that they have is evidence-based. My sophomores right now, they've only ever experienced this.
And you can take little snapshots. Like I used to teach AP biology, and so you track scores over the years, and that AP bio course, it basically grew every year, more non-traditional students coming in. There was a shift to EBR, and lo and behold, those scores stayed exactly the same. So they didn't drop. And that's bringing in all sorts of non-traditional kids and the course growing substantially.
I would also wager just anecdotally that like our kids are doing so much more with the science now than they were doing before. When I would give them a multiple choice test where they would have to select answers, it seemed much more rote memorization. Just some of like the practice I was doing in class, like let's drill in these vocab words and let's make sure that you memorize these are the reactants and these are the products or whatever it happened to be. Now it's so much more, in order to construct a good explanation, they have to be proficient with the understanding of the material. I care a lot less about all the minute little details, and I care a lot more about more global understanding of the DCIs. And I think that I just remember like the first couple of years of this being blown away by what the students are doing now compared to what they were doing before.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Your answers and insights are going to be super helpful to our staff. So we really appreciate it.